Continence and Marriage, Vocation of Historical Man. General Audience number 77 of April 7th, 1982. With our eyes turned to Christ, the Redeemer, we now continue our reflections on celibacy and virginity for the kingdom of heaven according to Christ's words reported in Matthew chapter 19, verses 10 through 12. When he proclaims continence for the kingdom of heaven, Christ fully accepts all that the Creator wrought and instituted from the beginning. Consequently, on the one hand, that continence must demonstrate that man in his deepest constitution is not only dual, but also in this duality alone, before God and with God. Nevertheless, on the other hand, that which in the call to continence for the kingdom of heaven is an invitation to solitude for God, respects at the same time both the dual nature of humanity, that is, in its masculinity and femininity, and also that dimension of the communion of existence that is proper to the person. The one who, in conformity with the words of Christ, adequately grasps the call to continence for the kingdom of heaven, follows this call, and in this way preserves the integral truth of his humanity without losing along the way any of the essential elements of the vocation of the person created in the image and likeness of God. This is important for the idea itself, or rather for the ideal of continence, that is, for its objective content, which appears in the teaching of Christ as a radical novelty. It is equally important for realizing that ideal, that is, in order that the concrete decision made by man to live in celibacy or virginity for the kingdom of heaven, by the one who makes himself a eunuch, to use Christ's words, might be fully authentic in its motivation. From the context of Matthew chapter 19, verse 10 through 12, it is sufficiently clear that the point is not to diminish the value of marriage to the advantage of continence, nor to eclipse one value with another. It is rather a question of breaking away from, with full awareness, that within man which, by the will of the Creator himself, leads to marriage and to go towards continence, which reveals itself before the concrete man, male or female, as a call and gift of particular eloquence and of a particular meaning for the kingdom of heaven. Christ's words, Matthew chapter 19, verse 11 to 12, begin with the whole realism of man's situation and with the same realism that lead him out toward the call, in which in a new way, though he remains by his nature a dual being, that is, directed as a man toward woman and as a woman toward man, he is able to discover in this solitude of his, which never ceases to be a personal dimension of everyone's dual nature, a new and even fuller form of intersubjective communion with others. This orientation of the call explains in an explicit way the expression for the kingdom of heaven. In fact, the realization of this kingdom must be found along the line of the authentic development of the image and likeness of God in its Trinitarian meaning, that is, in its meaning precisely of communion. When he chooses continence for the kingdom of heaven, man has the awareness that in this way he can realize himself differently, and in some sense more than in marriage, by becoming a sincere gift for others. Gaudium et Spes, chapter 24, verse 3. Through the words reported by Matthew, chapter 19, verse 11 to 12, Christ makes us understand clearly that this going toward continence for the kingdom of heaven is joined with a voluntary renunciation of marriage, of the state in which man and woman, according to the meaning the Creator gave in the beginning to their unity, became a reciprocal gift through their masculinity and femininity, also through bodily union. Continence means a conscious and voluntary renunciation of this union and all that is connected with it in the full dimension of human life and the sharing of life. The one who renounces marriage also renounces generation as the foundation of the community of the family composed of parents and children. The words of Christ to which we refer indicate undoubtedly this whole sphere of renunciation, although they do not dwell on particulars. And the way these words were spoken allows us to suppose that Christ understands the importance of such a renunciation, and that he understands it not merely in view of the opinions on this subject dominant subject dominant in Jewish society at that time. He understands the importance of this renunciation, also in relation to the good that marriage and the family constitute in themselves, because of their divine institution. Therefore, by the way he speaks the words in question, he makes us understand that this breaking away from the circle of the good, a break which he himself calls for the kingdom of heaven, is connected with a certain self-sacrifice. This break also becomes the beginning of further renunciations and voluntary self-sacrifices that are indispensable if the first and fundamental choice is to be consistent in the breadth of one's entire earthly life. And it is only thanks to such consistency that the choice is interiorly reasonable and not contradictory. In this way, the call to continence, as Christ expressed it, concisely and at the same time with great precision, outlines the profile of the mystery of redemption together with its dynamism, as already said before. It is the same profile under which Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, said the words about the need to keep watch over the concupiscence of the body, over the desire that begins to look and becomes already in that moment adultery in the heart. Behind the words of Matthew, both in chapter 19, verse 11 and 12, and in chapter 5, verse 27 and 28, one finds the same anthropology and the same ethos. The invitation to voluntary continence for the kingdom of heaven enlarges the perspective of this ethos. In the horizon of the words in the Sermon on the Mount, one finds the anthropology of a historical man. In the horizon of the words about voluntary continence, it remains essentially the same anthropology, but irradiated by the perspective of kingdom of heaven, or at the same time by the future anthropology of the resurrection. Nevertheless, on the ways of this voluntary continence in earthly life, the anthropology of the resurrection does not replace the anthropology of historical man. It is precisely this man, in any case historical man, in whom there remains at one and the same time the heritage of the threefold concupiscence, the heritage of sin as well as the heritage of redemption. It is this man who makes the decision about continence for the kingdom of heaven. He must make this decision by subordinating the sinfulness of his own humanity to the powers that flow from the mystery of the redemption of the body. He must do so, just as every other person does, who does not make a similar decision, and whose way remains marriage. What is different is only the kind of responsibility for the chosen good, just as the kind of good chosen is different. Right understanding of the superiority of continence for the kingdom of heaven. In his statement, does Christ highlight the superiority of continence for the kingdom of heaven over marriage? He certainly says that it is an exceptional vocation, not ordinary. He affirms further that it is particularly important and particularly needed for the kingdom of heaven. If we understand superiority over marriage in this sense, we must admit that Christ points to it implicitly. Still, he does not express it in a direct way. Only Paul was to say about those who choose marriage that they do well, and about those who are willing to live in voluntary continence that they do, quote, better. See 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 38. This is also the opinion of the whole tradition, both doctrinal and pastoral. The superiority of continence to marriage never means, in the authentic tradition of the church, a disparagement of marriage or a belittling of its essential value. It does not even imply sliding, even merely implicitly, toward Manichaean positions, or a support for ways of evaluating or acting based on a Manichaean understanding of the body and of sex, of marriage and procreation. The evangelical and genuinely Christian superiority of virginity, of continence, is thus dictated by the motive of the kingdom of heaven. In the words of Christ reported by Matthew chapter 19, verse 11 and 12, we find a solid basis for admitting only such superiority, while we do not find any basis whatsoever for the disparagement of marriage that could be present in the recognition of that superiority. We will return to this problem in our next reflection.